Much has been extensively and exhaustively argued regarding the countless horrors and humanitarian rights abuses of the Third Reich, as more and more often modern influencers have begun to sow seeds of doubt regarding the reality of the horrors of Nazi Germany. There should be no doubt regarding the reality of any of these things. However, some rather nutty individuals have begun to state that although Hitler may have orchestrated one of the most expansive and horrific genocides, well, at least the economy did well. As one source says, quote, in the space of 4 years, Nazi Germany changed from a defeated nation into full employment, with the strongest economy and biggest military power in Europe. As for the notion that the Third Reich achieved low unemployment or eradicated it, many seem to ignore why this was. By 1935, it had been made compulsory for 100% of males between the ages of 19 and 24 to work, and 4 years later, the same statute was applied to women. As early as 1933, communists, social democrats, syndicalists, and members of the socialist parties and resistance organizations were arrested, alongside Jehovah's Witnesses and some sparse churchgoers for political reasons. The Nazis had already founded some concentration camps in 1933 to institute forced labor for the German economy, such as KZ Dachau and KZ Oranienburg, which held hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and preceded the Arbeitsreich campaign, which sent thousands of German citizens deemed asocial into forced labor camps. It's no wonder that unemployment was reduced. However, in 1938, the Reich reported that of all of the agricultural jobs in Germany, roughly a fifth, or 500,000, had been lost since 1933, during a period in which Germany desperately needed more agricultural production. Furthermore, unemployment statistics were entirely falsified, as the Reich calculated their employment rates by excluding women from data and forming relief jobs to puff up their numbers. In the late 30s in Nazi Germany, the work week was mandated to be 60 hours in industry. On the lower end, textile workers worked a standard of 7 hours per day. Real hourly wages declined by 10% from 1931 to 1941 as purchasing power continued to fall in real terms despite employment growth. Weekly earnings only increased alongside work hours, and the men only received an average of 78.7 pfennigs per hour. Butter, sugar, and eggs alongside meat made up a significant portion of Germany's rising black market. By 1943, the elderly, disabled, and tubercular were forced into labor as the cost of living rose by 8.5% throughout the war. During the earliest days of the Third Reich, all labor unions were abolished by the state, and the DAF, or German Labor Front, was placed in charge of labor relations, which had the sole purpose of, as iterated by its leader, Robert Ley, to, quote, restore absolute leadership to the natural leader of a factory, that is, the employer. Only the employer can decide, unquote. I've heard some illiterate morons argue that the German Labor Front was an example of syndicalism because it represented one big union. Few ideas in history have been as stupid as this horseshit. The purpose of the DAF was not to bring about equality between these social classes, but to maximize the amount of labor that the state could coerce from the German people, with Hitler himself stating in the Ordinance on the Nature and Purpose of the DAF that the goal of the German Labor Front was to, quote, ensure that each individual can take his place in the economic life of the nation in the mental and physical condition which enables him to perform the highest and thus guarantee the greatest benefit to the ethnic community. In a complete negation of the Reich's goal of autarky and national self-reliance, international private corporations had complete control over German oil. Standard Oil, the AIOC, and Royal Dutch Shell had a complete grip over Germany's oil sector, controlling 72% of the market for diesel fuels, 55% of the gasoline market, and 50% of the lubricating oil market. This isn't what a strong national economic development looks like. This is what a crippled state which relies on foreign investment looks like. The DAF used funds which they had stolen from the workers' syndicates, which had been banned in 1933, to fund transportation projects. Ferdinand Porsche, the founder of the company by the same name, was contracted by Adolf Hitler in 1934 to develop and build the Volkswagen Beetle, and a Volkswagen Beetle was promised to every German citizen, leading to massive swaths of prepayments from individuals who assumed that they would be the future owners of the Volkswagen Beetle. These payments profited the German Labor Front 275 million Reichsmarks, while returning nothing to the general public, because the truth was that nobody who had paid forward was actually going to receive a single Volkswagen. The manufacturing of the Volkswagens exclusively aided the military-industrial complex of Germany. Not that it even mattered that much whether or not you had a car, as the price of gasoline in Germany at the time had skyrocketed to 200% higher than its price in the United States due to extremely high tax rates. Purchasing power was so devastatingly low during the Third Reich that by 1938, just over 50% of German citizens were able to afford even a simple radio, low numbers when compared to the 68% in England and 84% in the United States. According to a study conducted by Colin Clark, the standard of living in Germany throughout the 1930s was not even half that of the United States and was less than two-thirds that of Great Britain's. The sole and only reason why the Reich economy never completely collapsed during the 1930s was due to the usage of a dummy company known as MIFO, or the Society for Metallurgical Research LLC, which was used as a front to cover the rapidly increasing number of debts which plagued the Nazi regime. By 1936, the amount of funds available for government projects had largely dried up, and so terms for MIFO bills of exchange were increased to 6 months. In the meanwhile, corporate and excise taxes were raised in 1938, and the following year, in 1939, income taxes were selectively raised, and the redemption of MIFO bills of exchange was pushed backwards by almost 2 decades. Tax breaks were cancelled, and insurance taxes were raised. New taxes saw their introduction in the country this year, as the Reich could not continue to fund itself. This didn't really matter, and no tax hikes did, as in 1938, the Reich would officially enter a budget crisis. But nobody should deceive themselves into believing that because the Reich had high tax rates, that their economy was socially oriented in any way. The Reich's corporate tax rates generated no net negatives for the corporate elite of Germany. By 1938, the top 1% of the German population controlled 16.3% of the national income, a 45% increase in wealth concentration from Weimar, while the top 0.01% increased their share of the national income to 2.6%. Tax caps were held at 65%, benefiting the wealthy to an extraneous degree. The corporate elite really rarely had to ever live up to the Reich's tax system and were given frequent breaks despite official legislation in the late 1930s that officially dismantled all tax cuts. One very important example is the Krupp Group's Lex Krupp, which was allowed to avoid a 400 million Reichmark inheritance tax. The corporate profit explosion during the armaments boom of Germany also meant that the tax rate hikes for upper brackets did essentially nothing to alleviate wealth disparities in German society. For normal, everyday German civilians, excise taxes on goods like tobacco and alcohol continued to strain their actual purchasing power. By 1944, real per capita consumption dropped by 30% compared to 1938. If you think that utilizing 1944 data is unfair because of how long the World War had been going on for, then we can just consider the extensive rationing and inflation that had eroded any real gains before the war ever even took off throughout the 1930s. The so called wage gains that occurred under Hitler were just that, so called. They were nominal, they were not real wage gains. By the end of the war, the assets of Germany's banks were mostly comprised of worthless loans from the Third Reich, as well as claims against it, which now meant nothing. Throughout the 1930s, listed stock corporations languished and deteriorated as the number of listed stock companies fell by half, and stock exchanges were utilized to finance the horribly failing state. After 1938, the USSR became the only great friend to the Third Reich, becoming its single and only route to receive imports from Iran, Afghanistan, Manchukuo, Japan, and South America. According to the Reich, the import of raw materials to Germany was, quote, only possible with the raw materials of Russia between 1938 and 1941. Over the course of the entirety of the Reich, the government failed to inspire new foreign investment as its relations around the world deteriorated into the years leading up to the World War. The state gave extensive ground back to the capitalist class of Germany, undoing nationalizations which had occurred in the preceding era, allowing corporations to run the entire German economy. In 1936, the Vestag was reprivatized. In 1937, Dresdner Bank and Commerzbank were privatized. In 1942, Reichswerk Hermann Göring was 85% reprivatized, and, as said before, the large corporation Volkswagen was contracted by the government. The Germans used the Bond Stock Act to strengthen their internal private finance companies. MIFO itself, which backed the German economy, was in turn backed by the corporations Siemens, Krupp, Rheinmetall, and GmbH. Not to beat a dead horse, but AOIC, Royal Shell, and Standard Oil ran Germany's petroleum. Was Nazi Germany socialist? Certainly some members of the NSDAP were socialists. The Strasser brothers were undeniably some form of socialist, as was Joseph Goebbels, but the ideological inclination of certain members of the NSDAP differs from the facts on the ground. Independent labor unions were abolished and replaced by employers' associations. The nation's oil sector was dominated by international corporations. Key financial institutions were privatized, and the National Socialist People's Welfare was instructed to only aid those racially sound and politically reliable, excluding all Germans who were deemed, quote, asocial, including communists, socialists, social democrats, homosexuals, and others. Their welfare system, according to its own accounts, was only intended to help curate a productive citizenry. This was not, contrary to what some may claim, a socialized system. Some rebut, stating that the privatizations of German companies were a hack nationalization, as the privatized entities were put in the hands of party leaders. This would be a relatively good retort if the Nazis consistently did this, but in most cases the fact is that they didn't. Even if they had handed every single privatized company to a party member, all that this would mean would be that the large bourgeoisie now had even more of a stake in matters concerning policy of the Nazi state, which would just reinforce the relationship between the Nazis and the ruling class that existed beforehand. The economist Norbert Rath summed up the Reich's economy best, stating, quote, "In the first few years, it appeared to be successful in terms of economic policy, but was essentially based on the armaments boom and the preparation of a large, ultimately self-destructive war of conquest. The Nazi economy was set to implode from day one, because the only thing which propelled it forward was its preparation for World War II, and the only thing which kept it going in the 1940s, as the situation became more dire, was the active participation in the war, as without Nazi Germany's war economy, the nation would once again collapse. In conclusion, the story of the Third Reich is only one of a desperate, backwards, and bureaucratic cult slowly realizing the depths of its own ineptitude, a story all too commonly repeated in human history."